Hey all, this is Paul Carter, and this is my Module 13 case study. A good teacher turns bad. Stress at home causes problems at school. So category one is a problem identification and analysis. So what do I know? I divided what do I know and what do I need to know into three categories, and that is Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Horton, and Mr. Stafford. So Mrs. Wilson is the principal of Crestview Elementary for 3 years. She seems to have become a principal in the traditional way of going to college and getting her certification that way. She's respected and has a good relationship with parents. We know this because it mentions in the case study that there already was a good relationship between the school and the parents, and it has not changed, it seems, until the situation with Mrs. Horton that we will be getting into. And we also see that she claims to regularly observe teachers, including Mrs. Horton. We'll get into that, but she seems to be in and out of the classroom and understands and knows what is going on in her school. Mrs. Horton is the teacher, and we know that she's the former teacher of the year. She seems to have been an extremely effective teacher at some point, but there has been a recent change in attitude and teaching ability. She is no longer able to create relationships with her students and is being accused of verbally abusing even her students in her classroom, which is obviously unacceptable. And many parents have complained, not only to the school, but to the superintendent, and even four of the parents have gone to the school board with their concerns trying to get their students out of Mrs. Horton's classroom. The third person I have listed here is Mr. Stafford, and he is the parent that we have been given a name of. He's the father of one of Mrs. Horton's first grade students. Her name is Julie. And he is the one that sets up a meeting for the first time, at least for face-to-face, complaint about Mrs. Horton. He wants a parent-teacher conference, and Mrs. Wilson, as the principal, has agreed to attend this meeting as well. We know that he does not respect Mrs. Horton. We see that he wants his daughter, in quotes, it even says, I want her out of that woman's room, and that addressing a teacher that way is obviously not being respectful, so we know that he does not respect her in general. So what do I need to know about Mrs. Wilson? Well, whatever observation of Mrs. Horton's included, she has claimed that she has made these observations, but the case studies mention nothing about data or her findings besides she has not seen the verbal abuse. Has she asked for help from anyone in the district? We know that there's other elementaries in the same district. Has she asked those principals for any help? Has she talked to the superintendent besides that phone call? Has she involved the director of HR or the school counselor? During my plan of action, I will be involved in all of those. She has promised to investigate further. What does that entail? She has promised to the superintendent as well as to Mr. Stafford. So what is her plan there? There seems to be a plan, or is she just saying that to get them kind of off her case here at the beginning? Mrs. Horton is the teacher, but what has changed that causes attitude difference? We know from these other teachers that have taught for the past 8 years together that Mrs. Horton has not always been this way, and we have heard from them that Mrs. Horton's husband has left her to raise her two teen sons by herself. So she's bringing that struggle to school with her. Has any adult seen this verbal abuse in the classroom? That we know that there's some paraeducators in the building. Have they been in the classroom? I don't know. The case study doesn't say. Has any other teachers actually seen this besides just an attitude change of positivity? Well, have they seen any of this verbal abuse that we are hearing from the students? Or are these first graders who are 6 and 7 years old, do they not understand what verbal abuse is? And so then they're kind of blown out of proportion. Have we seen adults, have adults seen this in action? And then will she be able to set home life aside to be a successful teacher? At this point, she is not able to do that, so we're going to have to obviously address that. Then we have Mr. Horton, or Mr. Stafford, sorry. And what have his interactions with previous teachers been like? I know Julie is just a first grade student, but what was his interactions with her kindergarten teacher, or if there's any other siblings in the situation, what have his interactions been like with the teacher in the administration? Or is he a parent that just is always frustrated and wanting to change? Or is he genuinely concerned about Julie and doing what is best for his daughter? I don't know that. And then lastly, has he gone forward with anything besides the meeting? Is he one of those parents that have gone to board members, the superintendent, or is this his first step? Because I know his wife has sent some emails and phone calls, but is this his first step? Or has he had other steps before this? So obviously there's going to be 4 major problems, and the main one is Mrs. Horton is no longer an effective teacher. She is verbally abusive. At least there's claims of this. We're not positive of this, but there are claims. Bringing outside issues into school. She cannot control her emotions. We definitely see this in the meeting when she is screaming at Mr. Stafford, not able to control her emotions and act professionally. And then she's negative towards new things. When a new reading program is brought into school, she verbally attacks other teachers for supporting this when she doesn't like it. So she's unable to accept new things that she doesn't agree with. Parents are unhappy with Mrs. Horton. We know that this is an issue. Parents are complaining to board members and the superintendent. The good relationship with the school / district is probably going to be harmed. Even though it's good now, it probably won't last with the situation going through. Students are no longer happy or feel safe in Mrs. Horton's classroom. Students are going home crying. They don't want to go to school. At least we know this with Julie, and probably with other parents if they're already going to the board members. And then lastly, Mrs. Horton acted very unprofessionally during a meeting. She yelled and lost composure. That's unacceptable. So this is definitely a problem that will have to be addressed, which I will be addressing in my plan of action. So what is that plan of action with the strategies and how we're going to implement it? Well, it's going to be a short, simple plan of action with just 3 steps. Step 1 is we're going to utilize appropriate support. We're going to involve the superintendent, director of HR, so they are filled in. We could even potentially involve other administrators of those other elementaries, see what they have been doing to apply that into this case and learn from them. Strategy 2, we are going to have the school counselor speak with Mrs. Horton most likely that same day of that meeting, and bring the counselor in to find out exactly what Mrs. Horton's feeling, thinking, so that we can help Mrs. Horton emotionally as well, not just address her professionally, but her as a person. Strategy 3, we're going to set up a meeting with the superintendent, director of HR, Mrs. Horton, myself, potentially even that school counselor, depending on what her findings are, because we need to help Mrs. Horton. We need to help her become a better teacher, obviously, but we also need to help her as a person, and because we need to have that sit-down meeting to present to Mrs. Horton what we're going to be doing, which is handle the present issues. We're going to find a long-term sub and send Mrs. Horton home. Leave of absence, paid leave of absence, and we'll send her home. This will give her a little bit of time to reflect herself about how she acted in this situation. But we're also going to write a letter to parents to keep them informed and apologize for some of the behaviors that have been going on and just fill them in. Hey, we are addressing this issue. We are not just letting this issue go without investigating further. Step 3, we're developing Mrs. Horton as a teacher. We're going to center the relationship. Strategy 3 of step 2. I forgot that's important. And that's going to create an improvement plan for Mrs. Horton so that when she does return, we can implement it and she has to follow it to be able to continue being a teacher at our school. Because step 3 is developing Mrs. Horton as a teacher. We're going to send her to relationship / sensitivity training, get her there, let her reflect and learn again why it's so important to be able to build these relationships. And then we're going to put her in some other teachers' classrooms in our district and some other teachers that are amazing at relationship building and let her see why it's so important. We're going to formally and informally observe Mrs. Horton's classroom. If she gets back in that classroom, we are going to be in there at least daily once. More likely more than that, but we're going to be in and out of her classroom observing her. Strategy 4 is sad, but it's what has to happen, and that is if no improvements are made, we're not going to be able to renew Mrs. Horton's contract, or we're just going to flat out have to let her go in the middle of the school year. We can't let her continue to be an ineffective teacher that is potentially even verbally abusing students. That cannot happen at our school. How was I promoting the success of all students? Well, step 1, was it best for students? And I think it is, because it sets a precedent for this type of situation. Verbally abusing students is unacceptable. Teachers have to know this, community have to know this, students have to know this. Shows that district officials are also concerned. We involve in the superintendent, director of HR, school counselor, other principals. It lets everybody know we are all in this together and trying to help our students. Step 2 is handle present issues. It gives students immediate change of teacher. We get that long-term sub in there. It shows students how to take responsibility for one's actions and being inappropriate, being able to solve those issues. And it also creates an improvement plan for their teacher to make her a better one. And step 3 is developing Mrs. Horton as a teacher. Obviously is best for students because if it works, students are able to build positive relationships. Mrs. Horton hasn't been successful up to this point, so we'll be able to make that a more positive experience for them. There'll also be less complaints by parents, which isn't the main goal, but we want to keep that relationship with them a good one. If improvement plan does not work, future students will have a more positive teacher besides Mrs. Horton because she'll no longer be at our school. And once again, less complaints by parents. So what was I thinking, feeling, and valuing? Well, I was thinking that this issue needs to be solved quickly. We can't let it go on anymore. Mrs. Horton needs to be able to put aside her home life and not let it affect her relationship with her students, and always in the whole situation, what is best for these kids. I was valuing this, or I was feeling a little sad for Mrs. Horton. Tough situation. I understand things happen in life, but we got to be able to get past them. Frustrated that the situation has progressed this far. It should have been handled sooner, in my opinion, and sad for the students put in the situation for sure. I was valuing the student-teacher relationship, student success, school, and community relationships. I've addressed that quite a few times during this. Unresolved issues, there's quite a few, but Mrs. Horton's unprofessionalism, what are her consequences for this? Is Mrs. Horton going to be able to, again, become a successful teacher? How are the parents going to react? If they don't like the decision that we make, are they going to react good, or are they going to continue fighting? Is there going to be further student and parent backlash if Mrs. Horton doesn't adapt? Most likely yes, and so that will have to be dealt with as well. And then how can we respectfully deal with this situation with all stakeholders involved? We need to show respect to parents, teachers, and students. So category 5. Component 1. I promoted academic success for sure because I removed Mrs. Horton from the classroom, implemented a long-term sub, gave Mrs. Horton a leave of absence. That gives the students a break and a teacher that is more effective. We trained Mrs. Horton and gave her the opportunity to adapt by sending her to that relationship sensitivity training. We acquired the help of the superintendent and counselor. This kept my personal bias out of the situation, let someone look at it from an outsider point of view to help these students succeed academically. And lastly, always had all parties' best interests in mind. We ensured Mrs. Horton saw a counselor. We did not discipline without investigating. We did not embarrass anyone in the situation. I also promoted the well-being of every student because I removed Mrs. Horton from that classroom and got that long-term sub in there. I addressed Mrs. Horton's lack of relationship building. Verbal abuse will not be tolerated. We got her that training. We are going to make sure she can build those relationships. Mrs. Horton was given many resources to allow her to become a more effective teacher. We didn't just immediately fire her. We gave her the opportunity to improve through trainings, observations, and that leave of absence. And then lastly, if no changes are made, Mrs. Horton would be removed permanently. And this would allow students a teacher that could effectively build relationships, which is definitely part of their well-being. And lastly, that component 3, enhanced instructional capacity. I definitely have done this because I provided resources to Mrs. Horton through training and observations of other teachers. And then if no changes are made, a permanent change would be made, and that would be finding a more effective teacher. We built those relationships with this that could build relationships with students and increase engagement in the classroom, and that is obviously going to increase the instructional capacity. And lastly, the fight for continued parent support. We apologized to parents. We involved parents when needed. We didn't just push them out of the way and not involve them. We brought them into the situation only when needed. So the references there, that is that case study. I feel like in this situation, a lot of things were handled incorrectly, but I feel like this plan of action could help everyone in this situation, as well as in the future make changes to our observations and how we implement those in our school so that we can more positively ensure that students are getting the type of education that they need.